Alright, let's like, get it on. Hi! Hello! Oh my god. Why am I not? Yes, there we go. We are good. How come I'm pointing? I'm not supposed to be pointing, but you know what? Here we are, and I am pointing. Alright, class, settle down. What am I doing? Mina yokozo. Alright, class, settle down, and let me tell you. Yes, I know I am late. It's because I just got off a meeting. We're just our organization is going to confirm this tournament confirm the tournament for September. I've been given the responsibility of whatchamacallit, making contact of I've been given the responsibility of making contact with the venues, and the thing is doing my best, all right? And the thing is, yes, I'm a bit glad in a sense that you know what, even though I've just been on the phone for like the entire day. I've been on meetings the entire day. Here we are. Because I need to paint. I need to finish the stuff, right? This needs to be done in a sense that I bought like some of these for example, I bought this whatchamacallit, this unit. I bought this unit like I bought this unit like what 2 years ago, and I still haven't painted them. So yeah, at this particular point in time, even the primer is starting to crack. So what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to paint them. I have to paint them. This has to be done. This has to be finished. So yeah. The problem is that I feel like I'm forcing myself in a sense that I'm doing this, but the problem is that I usually only paint when I'm inspired. Maybe that's sort of the reason why this whole thing has like taken so long, because that's it, right? That's it. I only paint when I'm inspired. Basically, like for example, one of the reasons why whatchamacallit, my biggest reasons why my my sworn brothers and my veterans are wearing red is for the simple reason that they were inspired by British Grenadiers. And the thing is, British Grenadiers, whereas my Rangers have the blue and then the blue and the green top, for the simple reason that they were inspired by the American Navy SEALs during the Vietnam War, because Navy SEALs back then, what they would do is they would wear jeans as bottoms, and then they would wear their regular camo or tiger stripe camo for their tops. Why? Because jeans are much more durable, and the problem jeans are much more durable, and they would lose their blue sheen or their bluishness in a matter of hours walking through the swamps or walking through the jungles of Vietnam. So it wasn't really that much of a big deal. That's why they're wearing blue jeans. So for now, this has to be finished. And one of my biggest stumbling blocks, or one of the biggest hurdles that I'm trying to face right now, is this guy is what you'd call a watch marshal. My problem with this particular watch marshal is I don't know what color to finish him off with. He has basically two coats. First coat is of course the Night's Watch Black, which is fine. And then his top coat, the one that supposedly keeps him warm and the one that provides him status. I have yet to provide a color for it, or I can't seem to get a color for it, for the simple reason that I don't know what to color him with. I don't know what to color him with, for the simple reason that he's not he's a marshal. All right, marshal. Wait, hold on. What color did the French marshals French Napoleonic wars marshals marshal all right, he had several marshals. Joaquim Mora. Hold on. Let's see. Let's check the images. They're all over the place. The Napoleon's last great victory. Who's this? The uniforms are all over the place. You've got royal blue. You've got black, royal blue. Ah, French Marshal ne. Who's this? The marshals who deserve the baton and Napoleon. All right, who's this? Marshal Murat. The thing is, he's wearing like what? He's wearing cream white. I think he's wearing cream white. And then Murat. And then who else? Nepotism pick. You can count Marmont as well. Yeah, Murat. He's wearing white in this painting. And then yeah, green and then black. Some of them are wearing a green overcoat and then black. Some of them Napoleonic marshals. Okay. They're wearing blue. Uniform marshals of the uniform. They're all over the place. It's like I honestly can't they're all over the place in a sense that their colors, there's no John Baptiste, Bernadotte, and Greatest Marshals. Yeah, their color schemes are all over the place. Hold on. Marshals. The Marshals. They're all wearing like huh, bluish tint. They're all Napoleon's Marshals. They're wearing like blue. Jean Baptiste Bernadotte. Jean Lance. Marshals in uniform. Uniform. Yeah, they're all wearing some sort of royal blue. Huh. I may have to switch. Holy crap. Alright, French Marshal it is. Like deep blue. Can we like replicate this? Because the only thing left for this particular fellow is a touch up, and then after that I'm just gonna have to like brush like blue. They're all wearing blue. All right, blue seems to be Uniforms of the Napoleonic Wars in color. What's the color of a marshal? What's the color of a marshal? Huh. Oh, it's Insta. The Valora. Alright. Jean Lance. Marshal Jean Lance. Why is he blue? Why is he blue? And the thing is, I don't want to because here's the thing right now, if you guys can see, um the whatchamacallit, the horse blanket that he's riding on is blue. And yeah, I don't want to make it blue in a sense that it's going to cheapen the blue because he is a watch marshal. And the thing is, so I would either have to lighten up this particular blue, or B, either lighten up this blue, or B, darken it for a bit. Hold on. So I guess we can ultramarine blue it. But the thing is, this ultramarine blue that I have from Armored Komodo is bad. I wouldn't trust it. This particular one, but for now it would do. I'm just gonna have to change the color of the horse blanket. To black, no. Yeah. I'm gonna give him brown boots, and then I'm gonna shift the horse blanket to. I don't know what to shift the horse blanket to. Because if I give it blue, I'm just gonna cheapen the whole thing. Hmm. Should I put it to red? The horse blanket to red? Or just give it plain black? Yeah. Contrast my. Let's give it the contrast. So we're gonna do ultramarine blue for the. We're gonna do ultramarine or Oxford. Is Oxford better? Yeah, let's do ultramarine first. See what happens, and then we can Oxford blue it. If it doesn't work, if I don't like it, and yeah, we're fine. Let's do that. Let's do that. Fine. So we'd finally finished this Marshall because the only thing left for this particular guy is the basing, and the thing is, I'm quite lazy when it comes to basing. The story behind this guy is that whatchamacallit, he's a Night's Watch brother who basically sneaks out to compete in tourneys. So imagine Nacho Libre. So I'm just gonna base this. I'm gonna base this guy. And yeah, we have to get on with the story. For the story, I actually sent an email and I actually sent a letter in that for our next one. Hold on. For our next one, we are going to go and listen to whatchamacallit, Warhammer Fantasy Stories for our next painting session. Because here's my whatchamacallit, my promise is now is that we're gonna make paint because back then we just paint just for the hell of it. But now what I'm planning to do is that we're going to make these painting sessions a regular thing, in order to basically, in order for me to, stop being so lazy and actually get on with it. So yeah, we'll be finishing off the Marshall, see what happens, okay? So I finally base these, at least by tomorrow I could say that, I could just spray on the top coat for these two, and then we just, move forward. Yeah, that's it. That's the plan for tonight. Okay. That's the plan for tonight. So again, you guys, for tonight's story, why Warhammer 40k has the most terrifying zombie. Again, like it for if you do, and subscribe. Emperor knows we need it. Yeah, we're just gonna get black for the horse blanket because I don't want to cheapen the color blue while we're here. So yeah, hold on. Okay, I'm gonna cheapen the color blue because we're going to make him into a marshal. But we're gonna have to give it a different shade, like a darker blue, because I don't want to look either a darker blue or a lighter blue because We already have blue jeans for our rangers, and I don't want to make it look like he's wearing, because look at this, this is blue, right? Blue, beautiful, but I don't want to make it look like he's wearing a horse blanket or he's wearing jeans or something. He's a marshal, and the thing is, according to the examples, there is no it's unacceptable for a marshal. They're all wearing blue. Even Napoleon is wearing deep blue. Even Napoleon is wearing deep blue. Jean Lance, the Grand Army, Marshal of the Grand Army, full dress uniform is blue. Is blue. Marshal of the Grand Jean Baptiste Bernadotte, Jean Lance. All right. Jean Lance. Okay, let's go.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
War.
And sometimes, the enemy you put down gets back up.
Yeah,
That's
zombies.
the part nobody prepares you for. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a world called Morthaven Quintus, where a routine pacification mission turned into something that doesn't end. Told by Corporal Fenig Trask, 206th Geltian Line Infantry, a hive-born ash runner who grew up learning one rule: don't hesitate, or the ground swallows you. Turns out that rule applies on Morthaven too, just not the way he expected.
Interesting.
This is a plague story, not the kind where you cough and die. The kind where you cough and die and get back up, and your friends have to shoot you in the face, and then you get back up again. The kind where the dead outnumber the living so completely that the word outnumbered stops meaning anything. And the only thing left to do is stand on a wall and keep pulling the trigger for one more minute. One more minute.
Because what else is there
That's all
supposed to
any
do?
of them are buying. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
Nice.
The first one I shot in the face got back up. That is the part nobody prepares you for. Not the smell, not the sound they make, not even the way their skin moves, like there is something underneath it trying to get out. It is the moment you put a last bolt clean through a man's forehead, and he hits the floor, and you think it is done, and then 3 seconds later his fingers start twitching, and his neck rolls sideways, and he's looking at you again with those milky, blown-out eyes. That is when you understand, deep in whatever part of your brain still remembers how to feel fear, that this is not a war. Not really. Wars end. This was something else entirely, and by the time I understood what it was, there was no leaving Morthaven Quintus for anyone. My name is Fenig Trask, Corporal, 206th Geltian Line Infantry, 3rd Company.
Corporal, so that makes him squad leader.
2nd Platoon, which at time of deployment numbered 38 men and women, and by the end numbered less than I have fingers. We were called the Ash Runners back home, which was not an official designation and no officer ever used it, but every trooper in the regiment knew the name. It came from Gelt Novus, from the ash wastes between the hive clusters where the recyc runoff settled in gray drifts that
made a mistake. Black was overpowered.
Could swallow a crawler. Growing up in Hive Kosengard, you learned to run across those wastes fast or not at all. The ash would pull you under if you hesitated. It is a stupid detail, and it does not matter except that it does, because that is what I kept thinking about at the end. Hesitation. How everything on Morthaven Quintus moved slow, so slow, shuffling and groaning and leaking, and we still could not outrun it. I should start at the beginning, or close to it. The 206th was shipped out of Gelt Novus in the last quarter of the year, standard Terran reckoning, bound for Morthaven Quintus on what the briefing slate called a civil pacification action. Those 3 words should have been our first warning. In my experience, when the Departamento Munitorum uses calm language, the situation on the ground is anything but calm. I had been in the Guard for 9 years by then. 3 campaigns. Enough time to know that the machine of the Imperium does not waste a full regiment on civil unrest unless the unrest has teeth. But orders are orders, and the troop ships do not come with windows, so you sit in the dark hold with your kit on your lap, and you listen to the engines thrumming through the hull, and you tell yourself it will be a garrison posting. You tell yourself a lot of things in transit. Most of them turn out to be lies you were kind enough to offer yourself. The 206th was not an elite outfit. I want to be clear about that from the start. We were line infantry, Astra Militarum standard issue, drawn from the mid-hive working tiers of Kosengard, Hablock sons and daughters, recyc plant workers, factorum hands, people who grew up breathing filtered air and eating nutrient paste and learning early that the Imperium does not owe you comfort. It owes you a purpose, and the purpose it gave us was to hold a last gun and stand where we were told to stand. Most of us were adequate at this. Some were good. None of us were heroes, and I say that without false modesty. Heroes are what you find in the Schola pamphlets they hand out to Juviers to make them dream of dying for the Emperor. The rest of us simply tried not to die, and that kept us busy enough. Sergeant Brennick Hall, the senior NCO in our platoon, who had been in the regiment since before I could properly shave, used to say that the difference between a hero and a corpse is that the hero got lucky first. Brennick was not a philosopher. He was a squat, scarred, heavy-jawed man from Kosengard's lower mid-tiers, who could strip a lasgun, blindfolded, and who drank his recaf with an amount of sweetener that bordered on heretical. But he understood something about the Guard that the pamphlets never told you, which is that survival is not glamorous and does not make for good stories, and that the men and women who come home are usually the ones who mastered the very simple art of keeping their heads down and their lasguns charged. I respected Brennick more than any officer I ever served under, and I need you to know that now because of what happened to him later. Morthaven Quintus was supposed to be a good world, a real world, the kind hive-borns like.
I mean, you have to consider what type of respect, comes from a tough guy. It's like that story. I honestly can't remember which comedians told this story, but if you see like a group of like black guys, there's almost always this one white guy, and the thing about that particular white guy is that that white guy is the one you should be afraid of because that white guy did something to earn the respect of the other black guys. So yeah, there's that.
Like us, talked about in the holds with a mix of reverence and suspicion. It was classified as a civilized world in the Administratum records, which meant it had actual cities with streets you could see the sky from, actual agriculture outside the walls,
Interesting.
actual breathable atmosphere that had not been recycled through 600 kilometers of ductwork. When we made planetfall at the primary landing fields outside the capital, Coravile, the first thing I noticed was the air. It tasted wrong. Not wrong in the way Kosengard air tasted wrong, which was a metallic flatness you stopped noticing after your first decade. This was different. There was a sweetness to it, faint, like fruit left too long in a storage bin.
Interesting.
Not unpleasant exactly, just present in a way clean air should not be. I remember stepping off the lander ramp and taking a breath and thinking that the planet smelled tired, which is not a rational thought. But I have learned to trust the irrational ones. They are usually the ones trying to save your life. Coravile was a city of perhaps 11 million souls, built along the banks of a wide brown river called the Vasht. Standard imperial civic architecture, ugly and functional, with administratum spires and ecclesiarchy cathedrals, and hab districts stacked along grids that were efficient and soulless. The streets were wide enough for chimera columns. There
Good
was a
enough.
Mechanicus enclave on the western outskirts and a PDF garrison complex to the north, and the whole thing was ringed by a low curtain wall that might have stopped a determined mob, but would not have slowed down anything with armor plating. It was, in every measurable way, an ordinary imperial city on an ordinary imperial world, and it was already dying when we arrived. We did not know that yet. What we knew was what the briefing told us, which was that Morthaven Quintus had experienced a series of civil disturbances in the outlying districts attributed to labor unrest, food supply disruptions, and a suspected increase in cult activity. The Planetary Defense Force had been unable to contain the situation, and the planetary governor, a man named Aldrin Fask, had requested Astra Militarum support through the proper channels. Our mission was straightforward: reinforce the PDF, establish order in the affected districts, identify and neutralize any cult elements, and remain on station until the situation was deemed stable. It was the kind of mission that sounded clean on a briefing slate and got messy the moment boots hit dirt. And I had done enough of them to know that the word cult in an official briefing meant that someone higher up the chain was already worried about something they were not willing to name. Third Company was assigned to the industrial ward on the eastern edge of Coravile, a district called the Thornfield. It was a factory zone, mostly, heavy manufacturing and bulk processing, with worker hab blocks packed between the factorum complexes like afterthoughts. The streets were narrow and poorly lit, the kind of urban terrain that made you instinctively check corners and roof lines even when nobody was shooting at you. The hab blocks were standard imperial working class, meaning they were concrete boxes stacked 8 or 10 high with communal water points and shared sanitation.
I've always wondered about the septic tank or the septic lines and these things.
There were people living in them when we arrived, though fewer than there should have been. The ones who were there watched us from doorways and window slits with the particular blankness of people who had learned that uniformed strangers rarely brought good news. I did not blame them for that. I would not have trusted us either. The first 3 days were quiet in the way that a held breath is quiet. We established a company command post in a decommissioned Arbites substation, set up patrol rotations, and began the tedious process of mapping the ward. The PDF had given us outdated charts and vague warnings about unrest in the lower blocks that could have meant anything from a food riot to a full insurrection. Captain Henk, our company commander, was a cautious man who believed in thorough reconnaissance before action, which was either wisdom or cowardice, depending on who you asked. I thought it was wisdom. He sent squads out in rotation, 4-hour sweeps, walking the streets, checking intersections, talking to what local authority remained. The Arbites had pulled out of Thornfield 2 weeks before our arrival, which was another warning sign that nobody wanted to name out loud. When the law leaves a district, it is because the law has already decided that district is lost. I ran my squad through the eastern edge of Thornfield along the Factorum Row, where the big processing plant stood dark and silent. Half of them had been shut down. Power supply disruptions, we were told. Workforce shortages. The
Uh-huh.
explanations were always administrative, always delivered with the particular blandness of people who had been trained to describe catastrophe in the language of paperwork. But when you walked past those dead factories at night, with your lamp pack cutting a white cone through air that tasted of that same wrong sweetness, and you saw the doors hanging open and the equipment left mid-cycle as if everyone had simply walked away in the middle of a shift, the administrative explanations felt thin. Private Yelsa Danek, who was 19 and had been in the regiment for less than a year, asked me on the second night patrol why the factories had stopped. She was from Kosengard's upper mid-tiers, better educated than most of us, with a face that still had the softness of someone who had not yet learned to stop asking questions that did not have safe answers. I told her the factories had stopped because factories stop sometimes, and that our job was not to wonder why, but to make sure the streets stayed clear. It was a corporal's answer. It was not a good one. On the third
Doesn't need to
night, we
be.
encountered a priest. He came out of a side street near Factorum Row, moving quickly but not running, wearing the black cassock and devotional stole of an ecclesiarchy confessor. He was an older man, tall, thin in the way that ascetics are thin, with a long face and deep-set eyes that held a quality I mistook at the time for piety, but have since come to understand was something entirely different. He carried no weapon and no pack, only a battered copy of the Electitio Divinitatus clasped against his chest, and when he saw my squad, he tucked the book under one arm and made the sign of the Aquila, crossing his arms over his chest in the imperial gesture of devotion. I remember his hands. They were large and very steady, and the nails were immaculately clean, which struck me as unusual for a man who had apparently been wandering a deteriorating district at night. His voice when he spoke was calm and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to addressing congregations. He told us his name was Father Eustace, and that he had been visiting the faithful in the worker habs, delivering comfort to those too frightened to leave their dwellings. He told us the people of Thornfield were terrified, that something was spreading through the lower blocks that was not merely sickness, and that the ecclesiarchy owed its flock presence in times of darkness, even when, perhaps especially when, the darkness was of a kind that defied easy explanation. He
Uh-huh.
asked if we had seen anything unusual. I told him about the shutdown factories, the missing workers, the smell. He listened with attention that felt genuine, nodding slowly. And when I finished, he placed his hand on my shoulder and spoke a blessing over the squad, his voice dropping into the low, resonant cadence of formal ecclesiarchy prayer. The words were orthodox. The gesture was correct. The blessing, by every metric I could judge it, was proper and devout. Danek bowed her head. Petchov stood still and let it happen with the tolerant patience of a man who does not put much stock in blessings, but sees no harm in them either. I thanked the father, and he inclined his head with a grave smile and told us that the Emperor protects, and then he walked back into the dark side street from which he had come. And I watched him go and thought nothing of it, except that it was reassuring to know that someone in this district still cared enough about its people to walk the streets at night. I filed the encounter in a brief
Always these stories about brave priests, especially those assigned to to dark or depressing areas. And they were Irish.
patrol report and did not think about Father Eustace again for 29 days. When I did think about him again, it was not with reassurance. On the fourth day, we found the first body. It was in an alley between two hab blocks, folded against a drainage grate, like someone had propped it there and forgotten about it. Private Petchov spotted it on a routine sweep, called it in, and we moved to investigate with the weary professionalism of soldiers who had seen corpses before and expected this one to be unremarkable. Gren Petchov was built like a chimera and about as
Big man.
talkative, a man from Kosenzengard's lower tiers, who had the useful quality of being very difficult to frighten and the less useful quality of being very difficult to hurry. He stood over the body with his last gun at rest and his face showing nothing, and when I came up beside him and looked down, I understood why he was showing nothing, because the alternative would have been to show too much. The body was a woman, middle-aged, dressed in the drab utility clothing of a factorum worker.
Hmm?
She had been dead for perhaps 2 days, judging by the bloating. That much was normal, if death can ever be called normal. What was not normal was the color of her skin, which had gone a mottled greenish-gray that I had never seen on a corpse before. even the ones left in Kosengard's sump water. What was not normal was the way her veins stood out against that discolored flesh like dark roots, visible even through her clothing where it had ridden up. What was not normal was the smell, which was not the smell of ordinary decomposition, but something thicker, wetter, almost organic in its intensity, like the air itself around her body was rotting in sympathy. And what was definitely
Rotting in sympathy. Holy hell.
not normal were the small, hard, horn-like protrusions pushing through the skin of her forearms, each one no larger than a finger joint, yellowish and sharp and glistening faintly in the light of my lamp pack. Petchoff looked at me. I looked at Petchoff. Neither of us said anything. There are moments when silence is not cowardice, but the only rational response to something your mind has not yet agreed to process. I called it in. Mediki Verth came down to examine the body, and I watched her face as she worked, because Osla Verth was a professional who kept her reactions locked behind a mask of clinical detachment, and if something broke through that mask, it meant the situation was worse than it looked. She did not say much. She took samples, logged the body's condition on her data slate, and told us to mark the location and not touch anything with bare skin. When I asked her what had killed the woman, she looked at me with those careful, guarded eyes and said it appeared to be a pathogenic infection of unknown origin. When I asked her about the growths on the woman's arms, she said she would need to analyze them further. When I
What does
asked her
that
if we should
mean?
be worried, she paused for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable and said that we should maintain standard hygiene protocols and report any similar findings immediately. It was a Mediki's answer. It was not a good one either. We found 6 more bodies over the next 2 days, all in the Thornfield district, all showing the same discoloration, the same dark veining, the same horn-like growths in various stages of development, all dead for varying periods, some fresh enough that the skin was still soft, others bloated and leaking fluids that were the wrong color and the wrong consistency. The smell got worse as the count rose, not just from the bodies themselves, but from the air, from the streets, from the water that ran through the open gutters. That sweetness I had noticed on arrival had deepened into something you could taste at the back of your throat, a cloying, organic thickness that no amount of breathing through your mouth could avoid. Danik started wearing her rebreather on patrols. I told her it
Good
was
idea.
not necessary. I did not tell her that I wanted to wear mine too, because a corporal does not admit to the same fears as his troopers. That is not bravery. That is just the job. Captain Henk reported the findings up the chain and received back a directive to continue monitoring and await further instruction. The directive came from Regimental Command, which was operating out of the PDF Garrison Complex on the north side of the city. And it had the tone of an order written by people who were receiving information they did not want, and responding by pretending it was routine. Brennick read the directive, spat into his recaf, and told me that we were on our own, which was not literally true, but felt true in the way that mattered. When the chain of command starts moving slowly, it is because someone up the line is trying to decide how much of the truth they can afford to acknowledge. I had seen it before. The machine of the Imperium is vast and powerful, but it runs on information that has been filtered through a dozen layers of bureaucracy, and each layer shaves off a little more of the truth until what reaches the top is a smooth, harmless summary that bears only a passing resemblance to the horror happening on the ground. On the 7th day,
Interesting.
the first one moved. It was not one of the bodies we had already found. It was a man, alive, or what passed for alive, walking down the center of Factorum Street, 11 at midday, in full view of Petchoff's fire team. Petchoff called it in as a civilian contact, possible intoxication, requesting guidance. I was 2 streets over with the rest of the squad, and I reached his position in under 3 minutes, And in those 3 minutes, the situation had already changed in ways that made the previous week's unease feel quaint. The man was wearing a Factorum worker's coverall, same as the dead woman in the alley. He was walking, but walking is a generous word for what he was doing. He was moving forward with a lurching, uneven gait, his left leg dragging slightly, his arms hanging loose at his sides with the fingers curled inward like they had forgotten how to open. His head was tilted at an angle that suggested his neck muscles had stopped working properly on one side. His skin was the same greenish-gray as the corpse's. His veins stood out dark and swollen against his throat and forearms, and his mouth was open, not wide, just slightly, and from it came a sound that I will carry with me until whatever end finds me. It was a moan, low and continuous, not loud, not aggressive, just a steady outpouring of sound that had no words in it and no meaning that any human throat should have been able to produce. It was the sound of something that had been a person and was now a vessel for something that was not pain exactly, but was adjacent to pain in the way that a shadow is adjacent to the thing that casts it. Petchov had his last gun up. His fire team, 2 troopers named Vasek and Kolm, flanked him with their weapons at the ready. They were trained soldiers doing what trained soldiers do when confronted with a potential threat, which is to establish a firing line and wait for orders. The man kept walking toward them. He was maybe 20 meters out when I arrived, and maybe 15 by the time I had assessed the situation. He did not react to our presence. He did not look at us, not directly, though his head turned slightly in our direction, the way a blind man might turn toward a noise. The moaning did not change pitch or volume. He just kept coming, one dragging step at a time, and the smell reached us before he did, that same thick sweetness but concentrated now, personal, radiating from his body like heat from a furnace. I told him to stop. I used the command voice they teach you, the one that carries authority even when you do not feel it. He did not stop.
Why would
I told him again, louder, identifying us as Astra Militarum and ordering him to halt and identify himself. Nothing. 10 meters out now, and I could see the details that distance had mercifully blurred. The horn-like growths on his skull pushing through the skin above his temples, the way his eyes had gone to a pale, filmy white with no pupil visible, the dark fluid leaking from the corners of his mouth with each exhalation of that terrible moan. The fingers of his right hand were fused together, the skin grown over them into a club-like mass that glistened wetly. He was not a man anymore. I do not know when he had stopped being one, but by the time I was looking at him from 10 meters away, the question was academic. I ordered Petchov to fire a warning shot. He put a last bolt into the ground 2 meters in front of the man. The man did not flinch. He stepped over the scorched patch of rock-crete and kept coming. 7 meters. 6. Petchov looked at me. I gave the order.
Fire!
Petchov's first shot took the man in the chest, center mass, exactly where years of training and drill had taught him to aim. The last bolt punched through the coverall and into the body, and the man jerked backward half a step, and a puff of something that was not quite smoke and not quite steam vented from the wound, and then he steadied himself and kept walking. Petchov fired again. Same result. The man took the hit, rocked slightly, and continued forward. There was no blood, or rather there was fluid, but it was dark and viscous, and it did not flow the way blood flows. It oozed. Vasek and Kolm opened fire without needing to be told, and for 3 seconds the man was taking hits
Took them
from
long
4
enough.
last guns at close range, and he staggered under the impacts the way a man might stagger in a strong wind, but he did not fall. His body absorbed the shots with a horrible, wet resilience, each impact punching through flesh that should have been dead but refused to acknowledge it. I raised my own weapon and shot him in the head. The last bolt went in above the left eye, and the back of his skull blew out in a spray of matter that was gray and green and wrong in every way that matters. He went down. He hit the
Finally.
rockcrete face first and did not move, and for a long moment the only sound was the ringing echo of our weapons and the ragged breathing of 5 soldiers who had just learned something about the universe that they desperately wished they could unlearn. Then his fingers twitched. I put
Head.
3 more bolts into his head before the twitching stopped, and even then I was not certain it had stopped permanently. I was certain of nothing anymore. The training manuals do not cover this. The uplifting primer, that thick little book of lies and optimism they issue to every guardsman, has a section on Xenos threats, and a section on heretic forces, and a section on maintaining faith in the Emperor in the face of adversity. But it does not have a section on what to do when a dead man gets up and walks toward you, and does not stop when you shoot him. That is the kind of gap in the literature that gets people killed. We reported the contact. Captain Henk ordered the body retrieved for examination and doubled the patrol frequency. Within 6 hours, there were 4 more contacts across the Thornfield district. Within 12 hours, there were 11. By the end of the second week, the word contact had been replaced in our informal vocabulary by a word that none of us wanted to use, but all of us were thinking, because when the dead walk and moan and refuse to stay down, there is only one honest word for what they are. And the Imperium of Man has a long and bloody history with that word. The plague was spreading. We could track its progress by the bodies and the walkers and the smell, which had become a constant presence in the Thornfield, like a 6th member of every squad. The water in the district's communal taps had taken on a faintly brownish tint that the Mechanicus Engenseers attributed to pipe corrosion, and that anyone with functioning senses could tell was something far worse. The civilian population was thinning. Some were fleeing to other districts, some were dying in their habs with the doors sealed, and some were joining the shuffling ranks of the walking dead. The moaning had become a background noise, audible at all hours, rising and falling with a cadence that was almost rhythmic, as if the dead were breathing in unison. You could hear it through walls. You could hear it through your helmet. You could hear it in your sleep. And that was the worst part, because sleep was already scarce, and the sound burrowed into whatever rest you managed to steal and turned it into something that left you more tired than before. Mediki Verth gave us what information she had, which was not much, and none of it was reassuring. The pathogen was biological in origin, but displayed properties that did not conform to any known disease template in the Medici Imperialis databases. It was transmitted through fluid contact, possibly airborne in advanced stages, and it attacked the nervous system first, then the major organs, then the musculature, shutting down the body's systems one by one while simultaneously preserving a baseline of motor function that allowed the victim to remain ambulatory even after clinical death. The growths, the horn-like protrusions, were some form of accelerated mutation triggered by the pathogen, though Verth could not explain the mechanism, and I do not think she wanted to. There was something in her voice when she briefed us, a controlled precision that I recognized as the sound of a professional describing something that terrified her in language designed to keep the terror at arm's length. What she did not say, and what none of us said out loud for another 3 days, was the word that explained all of it. The word that connected the moaning and the mutations and the resilience and the smell and the creeping, insidious corruption that was eating Thornfield from the inside out. We did not say it because saying it would make it real, and we were not ready for it to be real. We were line infantry from a hive world, and we had been sent to pacify civil unrest, and we wanted desperately for this to be a problem that las guns and discipline could solve. But the truth does not wait for you to be ready for it, and on the 15th day the truth walked into our perimeter in the form of a dead woman, wearing the robes of an ecclesiarchy lay sister, with an 8-pointed star carved into her chest, and the name of a god that is not the Emperor spilling from her broken mouth in a whisper that should not have carried as far as it did.
Ish.
Nurgle, Grandfather Nurgle, the Plague Lord, the
Oh,
Lord of Decay. Commissar Serrain shot her himself. He was a lean, quiet man, Serrain, not the bluster and bolt pistol type you hear about in stories. He wore his authority lightly and used his weapons sparingly, which made it all the more significant when he stepped forward and put a bolt round through her skull at point-blank range, and then stood there in the spray of corruption and said very calmly that any trooper who spoke the name of the ruinous powers outside of an official briefing would be executed. It was not a threat. It was information, delivered with the same flat practicality that Brennick used when he told you to clean your weapon. There are things you do not say because saying them gives them power, and in the Imperium of mankind, the names of the Dark Gods are at the top of that list. I understood the reasoning. I even agreed with it. But reason is a thin shield against a plague that turns your neighbors into groaning, shuffling instruments of a god whose name you are forbidden to speak. And the troopers who heard Serrain's order obeyed it with their mouths while their eyes said everything their voices could not. We were fighting chaos. We were fighting a Nurgle plague on a world that was supposed to be a routine posting, and the chain of command was still issuing directives about containment protocols and pathogen management, as if vocabulary could control the uncontrollable. I have thought about this in the days since, in the brief, quiet moments between the surges, how the machine of the Imperium responds to chaos contamination with procedures and language, and the comforting fiction that there are steps you can follow that will make it stop. There are no steps. There is only the fire and the faith, and the willingness to burn what you cannot save. And on Morthaven Quintus we learned that lesson one body at a time. The quarantine came down on the 18th day, not just for
finally.
Thornfield, but for the entire city of Coravile. Orbital augurs had detected similar outbreaks in 3 other population centers across the planet, and the decision was made at a level far above our company commander's pay grade to seal the capital and prevent the spread. The PDF locked the gates. The curtain wall, which I had dismissed as inadequate, suddenly became the boundary of our world. 11 million people and 1 understrength Imperial Guard regiment sealed inside a city that was rotting from the edges inward. When the announcement came over the Voxnet, Brennick was sitting across from me in the substation, cleaning his last gun with the methodical patience of a man who has done the same task 10,000 times. He did not look up. He just said, "Ash wastes," and I knew what he meant. The ground was pulling, and we had stopped running. Third Company's sector expanded as the situation deteriorated. We were no longer patrolling the Thornfield. We were holding it, or trying to, establishing barricade lines along the main arterial streets and trying to channel the growing tide of walkers into kill zones, where concentrated lass fire could bring them down in sufficient numbers to matter. It sounds clean when I describe it like that. It was not clean. The walkers came in crowds, dozens at first, then hundreds, stumbling out of hab blocks and factories and the dark places between buildings in an endless, moaning procession that had no tactics and no fear and no self-preservation and therefore could not be intimidated or outmaneuvered. You could only shoot them, and shooting them was an exercise in diminishing returns because they took so many hits to put down permanently that your power packs drained at 3 times the normal rate and the resupply chain was already struggling. Brennick worked out the mathematics one evening, sitting in the command post with a half-empty mug of recaf and a data slate he had borrowed from the quartermaster. Each standard-issue las-gun power pack held 60 shots on the standard setting. A single walker required, on average, 4 to 6 shots to the head to ensure permanent cessation, because the first 2 or 3 would damage the skull, but the corrupted biology would compensate until enough neural tissue was destroyed to sever whatever unholy connection kept the thing animate. That meant
Interesting.
each power pack was good for 10 to 15 confirmed kills. A trooper carried 4 packs as standard loadout, 6 on extended operations. Call it 60 to 90 kills per trooper before resupply. At the current rate of walker emergence in our sector alone, we were seeing 300 to 400 new contacts per day. The mathematics were simple and brutal, and they said that we were losing, slowly but with absolute certainty, because the enemy's numbers grew with every civilian who died, and our numbers only shrank. I saw Brennick do something that evening that I have never told anyone about until now. After the mathematics session, after he had laid out in cold numbers the inevitability of our defeat, he set down the data slate and walked to the back of the substation, where we had a handful of civilian refugees sheltering in the old detention cells. Among them was an old man, a Factorum shift supervisor named Geddes or Gaddis, something like that, who had been brought in with a broken arm during the last evacuation sweep. The old man was sitting on the floor with his back to the wall, and his eyes closed and his broken arm held against his chest with a strip of cloth that was doing a poor job of immobilization. Brennick knelt down beside him without a word, took the arm gently, unwound the cloth, and reset it with a competence that spoke of training I did not know he had. The old man hissed through his teeth, but did not cry out, and Brennick rewrapped the arm properly, using a technique that I recognized from Medici field manuals, binding it tight and clean with the same meticulous care he brought to stripping a las gun. When he was done, he reached into his chest pocket and pulled out one of his personal recaf sachets, the kind with the excessive sweetener that he hoarded like ammunition, and pressed it into the old man's good hand. He did not say anything. The old man looked at the sachet, and then looked at Brennick, and then closed his fingers around it, and Brennick stood up and walked back to the command table and picked up the data slate again, as if nothing had happened. I watched the whole thing from across the room and said nothing, because some moments are not improved by acknowledgement. They are what they are, small and human and ordinary, and on Morthaven, Quintus' ordinary human decency had become the rarest resource of all. The mathematics mattered because they were the kind of reality that a corporal lives with. Officers think in terms of strategy and objectives. Corporals think in terms of ammunition and bodies. And on Morthaven, Quintus both were running out at the same rate. My squad was holding a barricade on Foundry Street, a major east-west artery that we had blocked with overturned cargo haulers and welded scrap from the nearby Factorum. It was not elegant. It did not need to be. It needed to be solid enough to slow the walkers down and give us a clear field of fire, and in that regard it served. We rotated shifts, 4 hours on the line, 4 hours rest in the substation, though rest was a relative term when the moaning never stopped, and the walls shook every time something heavy hit the barricade. The walkers were not intelligent. They did not coordinate or plan, but they had a terrible, mindless persistence, an endless pressure that found every weak point and every gap with the patient inevitability of water finding its way through cracked stone. Donick adapted faster than I expected. She stopped asking questions around the end of the second week and started answering them, which is a transition that every new soldier makes at a different speed, and some never make at all. She was a good shot, steady under pressure, and she had the valuable quality of being able to function on 4 hours of broken sleep without losing her edge. Petchov was a rock, as always, immovable and uncomplaining, the kind of soldier who does not inspire stories, but without whom no squad survives. Vasek and Kolm were steady. Corporal Maven Stroud, who ran the squad next to mine, was holding her section of the barricade with the grim efficiency of someone who has decided that fear is a luxury she cannot afford. Maven was from the lower mid-tiers of Kosengard, same as me, and we had come up through training together, and there was between us the kind of unspoken understanding that develops between people who have shared enough misery to stop needing to explain themselves. She would look at me across the barricade at shift change, and I would look at her, and the look said everything that words would have wasted time on. We are still here. The line is holding. Keep going. It was Maven, as it happened, who found the first piece of the puzzle that changed everything. On the 22nd day, she led a patrol into a water processing substation 3 blocks behind our barricade line, following up on a report from one of the few remaining civilian administrators that the facility's output had been fluctuating. Water processing was not glamorous work, and not the kind of thing that typically drew a corporal's personal attention, but Maven was thorough in the way that people from the lower mid-tiers tend to be thorough, which is to say she treated every detail as potentially important, because in the hive the details you ignored were the ones that killed you. What she found in that substation was not a maintenance issue. The facility was one of 9 water treatment plants servicing Coraviel's eastern districts. Everything looked operational. Intake valves, filtration systems, distribution network, all functioning within normal parameters. What Maven also found, hidden behind a maintenance panel in the secondary processing chamber, was a device. It was roughly cylindrical, perhaps the length of her forearm, constructed from materials that were not standard Mechanicus issue, and it was connected to the main processing flow by a series of thin tubes inserted into the pipe junctions with a precision that suggested expertise and forethought. The device was warm to the touch. It vibrated faintly, and it was leaking a fluid into the water supply that was the exact same shade of brownish green as the discharge from The Walking Dead. Maven did not touch it. She backed her team out of the facility, sealed the door, and reported it directly to Captain Henk, bypassing the normal chain because some things cannot wait for procedure. Henk sent Medici-Verth and a Mechanicus Engenseer from the Western Enclave to examine the device, and within 2 hours we had our answer, or at least part of it. The device was a dispersal mechanism, crudely but effectively constructed, designed to introduce a biological contaminant into the water supply at a rate slow enough to avoid detection by standard monitoring systems, but fast enough to ensure widespread exposure within weeks. The contaminant was the plague. Someone had put it there deliberately. Someone had walked into that water processing plant, installed a piece of equipment designed to poison 11 million people, and walked out again. And they had done it before we arrived, before the PDF locked the gates, before anyone with the authority to act had understood what was happening. The implications of that discovery rolled through the company like a shockwave. This was not a random outbreak. This was not a natural disaster or an unfortunate mutation of some common pathogen. This was sabotage, deliberate and planned, and the planning had started long before the first body turned up in an alley in the Thornfield. Someone had engineered this. Someone who understood water systems and biological agents and the layout of Coraviel's infrastructure. Someone who had access to a Nurgle-tainted pathogen and the knowledge to deploy it, and who was, in all probability, still inside the city. Captain Henk ordered sweeps of every water processing facility in our sector. We found devices in 4 of the 9. 4 separate installations, each with its own dispersal mechanism, each positioned to contaminate a different section of the Eastern District's water supply. The engineering was consistent across all 4, suggesting a single source or at least a coordinated effort. The Mechanicus Engenseer, a terse individual named Fabricator Minor Golavast, who communicated primarily through irritated bursts of binary, dismantled the devices, and confirmed that they had been operational for approximately 30 to 40 days prior to discovery. 30 to 40 days. That meant the plague had been in the water supply before the 206th had even received deployment orders. Every person in the eastern districts who had drunk from a communal tap, washed with treated water, or breathed steam from a heating vent connected to the municipal supply had been exposed, including us. That was the moment the nature of the fight changed. Up until then, we had been soldiers holding a line against an enemy that was terrible but comprehensible. Walkers were walkers. They came at you and you shot them, and you tried not to think about the fact that they used to be people. It was ugly, but it was simple, and simplicity is the soldier's greatest comfort, because it means you only have to make one decision at a time. But the discovery of the dispersal devices added a dimension that simplicity could not accommodate. There was an intelligence behind the plague, a will, a plan that extended beyond the mindless hunger of the walking dead and into the deliberate, calculated corruption of a world. The walkers were not the enemy. They were the weapon. The enemy was something else entirely, something that thought and planned and understood how to use a city's own infrastructure against it, and that enemy was still operating within the walls we were trying to defend. Commissar Serene convened an emergency briefing for all officers and senior NCOs in 3rd Company. I attended as the senior corporal present, which was a distinction I had not sought and did not enjoy, as it meant standing in a room full of people who were deciding how to fight a war we were already losing while trying to look like I had something useful to contribute. Serene was direct. He told us that the plague was a deliberate act of chaos corruption. He told us that the source was almost certainly a Nurgle cult operating within Coravile. He told us that our mission had changed from containment to active counterinsurgency, and that we were now fighting a two-front war, one against the walking dead in our streets, and one against the living traitors who had put them there. He told us that reinforcements had been requested but were not guaranteed, that the planetary quarantine was tightening rather than relaxing, and that for the foreseeable future we should plan on the assumption that we were the only Imperial force capable of addressing the situation on the ground. Then he asked if there were questions, and the silence that followed was the silence of people who had too many questions and knew that none of the answers would be ones they wanted to hear. I went back to the barricade after the briefing and found Brennick sitting on an ammunition crate, eating a ration bar with the joyless efficiency of a man fueling a machine. I sat beside him and told him what I had heard because Brennick deserved to know and because keeping information from your sergeant is a good way to get your squad killed. He listened without interrupting, chewing slowly, his scarred face showing nothing. When I finished, he swallowed the last of the ration bar, folded the wrapper into a precise square, and tucked it into his chest pocket because Brennick was the kind of man who did not litter even in the middle of an apocalypse. Then he said something that I have carried with me ever since, not because it was profound, but because it was true in the way that only simple things can be true when everything complicated has failed you. He said, "The enemy is not the dead, Trask. The dead are just the ash. The enemy is whatever lit the fire." That night, Private Colm started coughing. It was a small cough at first, the kind you attribute to dust or dry air or the ever-present smell of decay that coated the inside of your throat like a film. Colm was young, 22 standard, quiet and competent and unremarkable in the way that the best soldiers are unremarkable, which is to say, he did his job and did not make problems, and you forgot he was there until you needed him. He coughed through his watch shift and into his rest period, and by morning the cough had deepened into something wet and persistent that he could not suppress. Medic Verth examined him, took samples, and said nothing, which said everything. She isolated him in a back room of the substation with a clean cot and a water supply that came from sealed Munitorum bottles rather than the city pipes. And she told me to keep my squad informed but calm. I told my squad. Calm was beyond any of us by then, so I settled for steady, which is different. Calm means you are not afraid. Steady means you are afraid and you function anyway. Every corporal in the Imperial Guard knows the difference. Calm deteriorated over 3 days. The cough became a constant racking thing that left him gasping and spitting fluid that grew darker each day. The veins in his neck and forearms began to darken, faintly at first, then with the unmistakable greenish-black tracery we had learned to recognize on the walkers. He developed a fever that peaked and broke and peaked again, in cycles that had nothing to do with his body's immune response and everything to do with the corruption working through his system with a patient, malignant efficiency. On the second day, he was lucid enough to tell me he could feel something moving under his skin, something that was not pain but was adjacent to it in the way the walker's moan was adjacent to speech, almost recognizable but wrong in a fundamental way that defied description. On the third day, he stopped talking. His eyes went glassy and unfocused, and his breathing took on a rattling quality that had nothing to do with his lungs and everything to do with the thing his lungs were becoming. Verth told me what needed to happen before I asked. She was a professional, and she understood the calculus of mercy in a way that most people prefer not to think about. I did not delegate it. That is not what a corporal does. I went into the room where Colm was lying on that cot, and I looked at what was left of a man I had served beside for 2 years, and I put my last pistol against his temple, and I gave him the only thing I had left to give, which was a clean end before the corruption could finish what it had started. He did not flinch. I do not know if that was because the disease had already taken his awareness, or because some part of him, deep in whatever remained of Private Colm, understood what was happening and was grateful. I choose to believe the latter. It does not matter whether that belief is true. It matters that I can carry it. We burned his body in the Factorum furnace behind the substation. Verth oversaw the process to ensure complete combustion because anything less risked leaving viable pathogen material. And on Morthaven Quintus, the margin between the dead and the walking dead was measured in cellular remnants that could survive temperatures well below incineration point. I stood and watched and did not look away because looking away felt like a betrayal. Donnic stood beside me, and at some point during the burning, her hand found mine and squeezed once, hard, and then let go. It was not romantic, and it was not comfort. It was one human being reaching for another in the dark to confirm that they were both still there. I have thought about that gesture every night since, in the hours when the moaning dips low enough to let you think, and each time I understand a little more about what it cost her and what it meant that she made it anyway. The losses mounted after Colm. The plague was in us, some of us at least, introduced through the contaminated water supply during our first days in the Thornfield before anyone understood the danger. Verth estimated that roughly 1 in 5 of the company had been exposed at levels sufficient to cause infection, though the progression varied wildly from person to person. Some showed symptoms within days. Some carried the pathogen for weeks before the first cough appeared. Some seemed immune entirely, though Verth cautioned that apparent immunity might simply mean a longer incubation period and that no one should assume they were safe. It was the kind of information that made every cough, every scratch, every moment of unusual fatigue into a potential death sentence, and the psychological weight of that uncertainty was in some ways worse than the plague itself. You can fight an enemy you can see. You cannot fight one that might already be inside you, waiting. We lost Vasek on the 26th day. He turned fast, faster than Colm, going from the first cough to full walker conversion in under 36 hours. We lost him on the barricade itself, which was the cruelest part, because one moment he was firing at the walkers, pressing against the scrap metal wall, and the next he was convulsing on the firing step. And by the time Petchoff and I reached him, his eyes had already gone milky, and the moan was beginning in his throat, that terrible low, continuous sound that I had now heard from hundreds of the dead, but had never heard from someone I knew. Petchoff held him down while I did what needed to be done. That was the second time. It was not the last. The city was dying in sections, like a body losing circulation to its extremities. The Thornfield had been the first district to fall completely, but the plague was spreading through the other quarters with the remorseless efficiency of water finding its level. The Western Industrial Zone went dark on day 24. The River District flooded with walkers on day 27, thousands of them spilling along the banks of the Vosht in a tide of gray-green flesh that overwhelmed the PDF checkpoints in hours. The commercial quarter held out until day 30, when the barricades along its southern edge were breached by a mass of walkers so dense that the defenders ran out of ammunition before they ran out of targets. Each district that fell added its population to the horde, and each addition made the remaining districts harder to hold. It was arithmetic, pure and simple, the same mathematics that Brennick had outlined with his data slate and his recaf, and the numbers had not changed in our favor. Regimental command had pulled back to the PDF garrison complex, which was the most defensible position in the city, and therefore the natural choice for a last stand that no one was willing to call a last stand. The rest of the regiment, 5 companies in various states of depletion, had consolidated around the garrison in a defensive perimeter that contracted daily as walkers pressed in from every direction. 3rd Company held the eastern approach, which meant we held the road from the Thornfield, which meant we were facing the oldest and densest concentration of walkers in the city. Captain Henk deployed us across 3 barricade lines in a staggered defense, with 2nd Platoon on the forward line, because we knew the ground better than anyone. Knowing the ground is one of those advantages that sounds significant on a tactical map, and means almost nothing when the enemy is a wall of moaning corpses that does not care about fields of fire or cover or any of the other concepts that make ground worth knowing. We held. I do not know how else to describe what we did during those days, except to say that we held. We fired and reloaded and fired again, and dragged our wounded back and burned our dead, and slept in shifts so short they barely qualified as unconsciousness, and ate rations that tasted like cardboard, and drank water from sealed cans and held. The barricade on Foundry Street became a wall of the dead, their bodies piling against the scrap metal in layers that were compressed by the weight of the walkers still pressing forward from behind. We had to clear the pile every few hours, which meant sending troopers out with incendiary charges to burn back the accumulation, and those were the worst moments because you were out in front of the line, exposed, with the moaning all around you and the dead pressing closer, and the knowledge that every body in that pile had been a person who had drunk the same water you had drunk and breathed the same air you were breathing. During one of those clearance operations on the 28th day, I saw a face I recognized. She was near the top of the pile, wedged between 2 larger bodies, her head turned to the side at the angle that gravity and compression had dictated. She was a woman in her middle years, wearing the faded blue smock of a Hab block domestic, and I knew her because I had helped evacuate her building on day 19 when the walkers had breached the adjacent street. She had been holding a child's hand, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7, pulling him through the crowd with the fierce grip of a mother who has decided that nothing in the universe will separate her from this one small person. I had guided them to the refugee column heading for the garrison, and as she passed me, she had looked at me and said, "Throne bless you, Corporal." And the boy had looked up at me with eyes that were too large for his face and too old for his age. I had told them to keep moving, and they had kept moving, and I had not thought about them again until I was standing in front of a pile of dead walkers with an incendiary charge in my hand, and her face was there, gray-green, the veins dark under the skin, the mouth slack, a small horn nub pushing through her temple. Her eyes were open. They were milky and vacant, and they saw nothing, but they were aimed at me. And in the fraction of a second before I turned away, I thought about the boy and where the boy was now, and whether his hand was still small enough to hold, and I could not finish the thought. I set the charge and walked back to the line and did not speak for an hour. I fixed things. That was how I coped, or tried to. When the shooting stopped and the waiting started, I found something to repair. A loose weld on the barricade, a jammed power pack coupler, a broken strap on someone's flak armor. I found the damaged piece and I focused on it with everything I had, every scrap of attention and skill, because while I was fixing something, I did not have to think about the things that could not be fixed. Danik noticed. She brought me a las gun with a cracked casing on the 29th day and set it down beside me without a word. And I looked at it and looked at her and understood that she was giving me something to do with my hands so that my mind could have a moment of quiet. It was a kindness so precise and so perceptive that it hurt more than anything the plague had done to us. Because kindness in a place like Morthaven Quintus was an act of defiance against a universe that was actively trying to grind it out of you, and defiance has a cost that only the defiant understand. The 31st day brought the second twist, and this one cut deeper than the dispersal devices because it came from inside our own ranks. Not treachery. Something worse than treachery, because treachery implies choice. And what happened to Medici Verth was the opposite of choice. It was the Imperium's own machinery turned against itself, a weapon made from trust and good intentions. Verth had been administering prophylactic injections to the company since day 12. Standard procedure for a plague environment based on medical supplies drawn from the Munitorum stockpile that had been pre-positioned at the PDF garrison before our arrival. The injections were labeled as broad-spectrum anti-pathogen boosters, stamped with the Medici Imperialis seal and accompanied by documentation that looked, in every respect, legitimate. Verth had checked the seals. She had cross-referenced the batch numbers with the Medici databases. She had done everything a competent Medici should do, and none of it had mattered, because the supplies had been compromised before they ever reached the stockpile. She came to me on the 31st day, and I knew something was wrong before she spoke, because Osla Verth did not come to corporals for conversation. Hank was on the forward line inspecting barricade positions and would not be back for hours. And I think Verth needed to say what she had found to someone before the weight of carrying it alone crushed whatever was holding her together. She was a woman who existed in the precise, clinical space between the soldier and the suffering, and she maintained that space with a discipline that I admired without envying. When she sat down across from me in the substation and folded her hands in her lap, in a gesture that was too controlled to be anything other than a substitute for trembling, I set down the power pack coupler I had been rewiring and gave her my full attention. She told me she had been running further analysis on the pathogen samples, trying to map its progression and identify potential vulnerabilities. In the process, she had cross-referenced the infection rates among the company's personnel with their medical histories, looking for patterns that might explain why some fell ill quickly and others remained apparently healthy. What she found was a correlation so precise and so damning that it had taken her 3 separate analyses to accept it.
What does
The
that
troopers
mean?
who had received the most injections from the pre-positioned medical supplies showed the highest rates of infection. The troopers who had missed injections due to scheduling conflicts, injury, or simple reluctance showed the lowest. The correlation was not perfect because the waterborne exposure complicated the data, but it was strong enough to be statistically inescapable. The prophylactic injections were contaminated, not with
Uh-huh.
the plague itself, not directly, but with a compound that weakened the body's natural resistance to the pathogen, something that opened the door for the waterborne contagion to take hold faster and harder than it would have otherwise.
Oh, it is
It was
sabotage.
elegant in the horrible way that effective evil is often elegant. The cult had not just poisoned the water. They had ensured that the soldiers sent to fight the plague would be pre-weakened by their own medical protocols, turned into ideal hosts by the very measures designed to protect them. And Verth had been the instrument of that weakening, injecting it into her comrades with her own hands, in good faith, following procedure, doing her job. I watched her face as she told me this. I watched the mask of clinical detachment crack along fault lines that must have been forming for days. And I watched what was underneath the mask, which was not weakness but a grief so profound that it had gone past tears into a quiet, vibrating stillness that was far more frightening than any display of emotion would have been. She had done harm. She had done it unwillingly and unknowingly, and in strict accordance with every protocol and regulation that governed her profession. And none of that mattered because the harm was done, and the people she had harmed were her own soldiers.
No, that sucks.
Colm had received 3 injections. Vasek had received 2. Every trooper who had turned, every trooper who was currently showing symptoms, had received at least 1 injection from supplies that Verth had personally administered. I told her it was not her fault. I told her that she had been used, that the enemy had exploited the system, that no one could have known. These things were true, and they were completely insufficient because guilt does not respond to logic, and Verth was not a woman who could be comforted by words when the evidence of her hands' work was walking the streets in a moaning gray-green tide outside our barricade. What she needed was not comfort, but action, and I gave her the only action available to me, which was to take the information to Captain Henk immediately and ensure that every remaining injection was destroyed.
As she
Henk
should.
received the news with the particular blankness of an officer who has absorbed too many shocks in too short a time and has reached the point where each new disaster simply adds weight to a burden that is already beyond bearing. He ordered the medical supplies destroyed. He ordered Verth confined pending investigation, which was regulation and which was also the wrong call, because Verth
needed
was
her
the
in the
only
front line.
trained medici in the company, and confining her meant our wounded would go untreated.
There
Brennick
it
went
is.
to Henk privately, and I do not know what was said between them, but Verth was released within the hour with a formal reprimand that existed on paper and nowhere else, and instructions to continue her duties using only supplies from confirmed Munitorum field-issue stocks. The system had broken Verth, and then, in a small act of pragmatism that passed for mercy, put her back to work because it needed her more than it needed to punish her. I watched her work that same evening. A trooper from 4th Squad had taken a piece of shrapnel from a walker's improvised bludgeon, a length of rebar that had shattered against his flak plate and driven splinters into his neck and jaw.
Wait, I thought
It was
these
delicate
things
work, the
were
kind that
dumb.
required steady hands and a clear head, and Verth performed it with a precision that I could only describe as savage. Not rough, not careless, but fierce in its competence, as if every suture she placed and every fragment she extracted was a personal act of defiance against the thing she had been made to do unknowingly. Her hands did not shake. Her voice, when she spoke to the trooper, was calm and professional and gave nothing away. But there was something in the set of her jaw and the focus of her eyes that I recognized because I had seen it in my own reflection during the late watches when I thought nobody was looking.
What else is
It
she
was the
supposed to
expression
do?
of a person who has decided that the only acceptable response to having been made an instrument of harm is to become, with equal deliberateness, an instrument of repair. Verth did not forgive herself. She never would. But she worked, and the work was good, and the trooper lived, and on Morthaven Quintus that was the only currency that retained any value. The question that followed the medical revelation was the obvious one. Who had compromised the pre-positioned supplies? The Munitorum stockpile at the PDF garrison had been assembled months before our arrival, administered by the Planetary Administratum in coordination with the garrison's Quartermaster Corps. The
Uh-huh.
supplies had passed through multiple hands, multiple checkpoints, multiple layers of bureaucratic oversight, and at some point in that
That they
chain,
did.
someone had introduced the contaminating compound with the same deliberate precision that had characterized the water supply devices. The cult had people inside the city's administration, not just sympathizers or dupes, but operatives with the access and the expertise to tamper with military medical supplies without triggering any of the Imperium's considerable security protocols. That meant the cult was not a fringe element hiding in the underbelly of the city. It was embedded, woven into the infrastructure, part of the machine. Commissar Serene reached the same conclusion independently and came to it with a cold fury that I had not seen from him before. Serene was not a man given to dramatic displays. He operated with a quiet precision that made his rare moments of visible emotion all the more significant. When he briefed the company's remaining officers and NCOs on the medical supply compromise, his voice did not rise above its normal conversational level, but the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees, figuratively if not literally, because the words he was speaking carried implications that went far beyond a tampered shipment of anti-pathogen boosters. He told us that Morthaven Quintus had been compromised at a systemic level. The cult was not an infection in the body of the city. It was a parasite that had been growing inside it for years, possibly decades, feeding on the Imperium's own structures and turning them into instruments of chaos corruption. The water supply, the medical infrastructure, the administratum, possibly the PDF, possibly the planetary government itself. He was right. We discovered how right on the 34th day, when a combined force from 3rd and 5th companies pushed into the sub-levels beneath the Ecclesiarchy Cathedral in the Central District, following intelligence extracted from a captured cultist who had been found trying to sabotage the garrison's backup power generators. The sub-levels were old. Coraville was not a young city, and its foundations went deep. Layers upon layers of construction stretching down into the bedrock, and the cathedral had been built on some of the oldest foundations of all. The cultist, before Serene's questioning broke him, had spoken of gathering places beneath the cathedral, of
Huh.
rituals, of a figure he called the voice of the garden, who had been speaking the words of the grandfather for longer than most of the cultists had been alive. What we found beneath the cathedral was a temple, not a crude assemblage of symbols and offerings, not the improvised shrines that low-level heretics throw together in basements and abandoned habs. This was a space that had been deliberately constructed over years, with care and resources and a devotion that would have been admirable if it had been directed at anything other than the annihilation of everything the Imperium stood for. The walls were stone, ancient stone from the city's original foundations, and they were covered in carvings that made your eyes water and your stomach clench if you looked at them too long.
They hurt to
The
look at.
carvings depicted things that I will not describe in detail because some images, once planted in the mind, grow like the plague itself, spreading through your thoughts until they have colonized every quiet moment. Suffice to say, they were devotional art dedicated to the Plague Lord, rendered with a skill and an intimacy that suggested the artist had first-hand knowledge of their subject. The temple was large enough to hold 200 people. The pews were carved from the same ancient stone, and worn smooth by decades of use. There was an altar at the far end, a massive slab of greenish-black rock that glistened with a moisture that had nothing to do with condensation. And behind the altar was a symbol that was 8-pointed and pulsing faintly with a light that was not light, a wrongness in the spectrum that your eyes registered as illumination, but your brain rejected as fundamentally hostile to the concept of sight. The air down there was thick with that sweet rot smell, concentrated to a degree that made your rebreather filters work overtime, and the walls were warm to the touch. Warmer than stone should be at that depth, as if something beneath them was generating heat. Biological heat. We found records, data slates, handwritten journals, correspondence on parchment sealed with wax stamps that bore the 8-pointed star. The cult called itself the Sodality of the Willing Vessel, and it had been operating beneath Coravile for 63 years. 63 years. 3 generations of human lives spent in patient, meticulous preparation for the day when the garden, as they called it, would bloom. The records detailed a
Interesting.
membership that had grown from a handful of original converts to a network of several hundred, drawn from every tier of the city's society. Factory workers, administratum clerks, water treatment engineers, PDF officers, medici staff, ecclesiarchy lay servants. The cult had recruited slowly and carefully, targeting individuals whose positions gave them access to critical infrastructure, and it had done so with a patience that was, in its own terrible way, a mirror of the disease it served. Slow, thorough, inexorable. The leader of the Sodality was identified in the records by his cult title, the Voice of the Garden, but his civil identity was there too, referenced in early correspondence with a casualness that suggested the cult had not always been as security-conscious as it later became. His name was Eustace Grael, and he was the senior confessor of the Coravile
Oh
Cathedral
my god, it was the
Ministorum,
priest they met in the
the
first.
man responsible for the spiritual guidance of the city's faithful, the man who heard confessions and offered absolution and stood before congregations of thousands to speak the word of the emperor, the man who, for 63 years, had been whispering a different word entirely into the foundations of the city he was sworn to protect. I did meet Eustace Grael. That is the part that keeps me awake in those hours when sleep is possible and consciousness is not yet a mercy. I met him on the 3rd night on a dark street in the Thornfield, and he told me his name was Father Eustace, and he blessed my squad, and he put his hand on my shoulder and spoke the Emperor's words with a voice that I believed. I believed him. I stood there in the dark with the plague already in the water and the dead already stirring in the lower blocks, and I let the architect of all of it touch me and speak over me, and I thanked him for it. When I read his name in the cult records, something inside me went very still and very cold, a cold that had nothing to do with the plague and everything to do with the understanding that evil does not always wear its face. Sometimes it wears the face of a concerned priest with clean fingernails and a steady voice and a copy of the Lectitio Divinitatus held against its chest like a shield. Sometimes it blesses you. By the time we found the temple, he was gone, vanished into the sublevels or the dying city, or wherever rats go when the flood finally reaches their nest. But I saw his quarters, a small, austere cell adjoining the temple that contained a cot, a writing desk, and a shelf of books that were bound in materials I chose not to identify. On the desk was an open journal. The last entry dated the day before our discovery, and the handwriting was precise and elegant. The same hand that had gripped my shoulder and spoken the Emperor's words over my squad. And the words were addressed to the grandfather with the intimate familiarity of a man writing to a beloved parent. He thanked the grandfather for the blooming. He expressed satisfaction at the harvest. He noted with what I can only describe as paternal pride that the garden was spreading beyond the city walls and into the outlying settlements, and that soon the entire world would be a single unified expression of the grandfather's love. He closed the entry with a phrase that I have never been able to forget, not because it was threatening or dramatic, but because it was spoken with the quiet certainty of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the rest of the universe to acknowledge it. He wrote, "The soil is rich, the seeds are deep. All that remains is patience, and patience is the grandfather's greatest gift." We burned the temple. Serene ordered incendiary charges placed at every load-bearing point, and we brought the ceiling down on the altar and the pews and the carvings and the journals. It was not enough. Burning a temple does not unburn a city, and the sodality of the willing vessel had done its work too well and too thoroughly for a few kilograms of debt charges to undo 63 years of patient corruption. But we burned it anyway, because there are things you do not do for tactical advantage, but for the simple, primal need to destroy something that should not exist. The fire felt good. I am not proud of that, but I am not ashamed of it either. On Morthaven Quintus, fire was the only cleansing agent that still worked. The perimeter shrank. That is the simplest way to describe what happened over the next 5 days, though simplicity does not capture the texture of it, the grinding, exhausting, hour-by-hour contraction of the space in which you are allowed to live. The outer barricade lines were abandoned on day 35, when the walker density exceeded our ability to hold them with the ammunition we had remaining. We fell back to the secondary lines, which were closer to the garrison and therefore easier to supply, but also meant abandoning 3 square kilometers of city that had still held pockets of living civilians. I try not to think about those pockets. I try not to think about the people we left behind the lines when we pulled back, the ones who were still alive and still human, and who watched us retreat and understood what our retreat meant for them. I try and I fail, and the failure is one of the smaller wounds that Morthaven Quintus has left on me, but one that will not stop bleeding. The secondary lines held for 2 days. They might have held longer if we had not lost a third of 2nd Platoon's remaining strength to a mass breach on the night of day 36, when a horde of walkers pushed through a section of the barricade that had been weakened by a subsidence in the street beneath it. The city's infrastructure was rotting along with its people, sewer lines collapsing, power conduits failing, water mains bursting and flooding the lower levels with contaminated fluid that sped the plague's spread into areas that had previously been clean. The breach cost us 11 troopers, some killed in the fighting, and some dragged into the horde and lost. Among the lost was Corporal Maven Stroud. I did not see her go down. I was 40 meters east along the barricade when the breach happened, and by the time I reached the breach point with reinforcements, the gap had been sealed with wreckage and fire, and Maven's squad had been reduced to 2 survivors, neither of whom could tell me what had happened to her, because neither of them had seen it either. She was simply gone, swallowed by the gray-green tide between one moment and the next, and the city did not give her back. I do not have words for what losing Maven did to me. That is not a figure of speech. I mean that I literally do not have the vocabulary to describe the specific quality of grief that attaches to losing someone who understood you in the particular, wordless way that Maven understood me. We had not been lovers. We had not been family. We had been something else, something that the Imperial Gothic language does not have a precise term for, which is 2 people who had been through enough together that they had become part of each other's architecture, load-bearing walls that you did not notice until one of them was removed and the ceiling started to sag. Maven's death did not break me. Breaking would have been a clean, dramatic thing, and this was neither clean nor dramatic. It was a slow settling, a shift in the internal geometry of who I was, and the shape I settled into was smaller and harder and less capable of the things that make a person something other than a weapon. I fixed things. I fixed things with a ferocity that bordered on compulsion, tearing into broken equipment and damaged barricade sections, with hands that needed to be doing something, anything, to avoid doing the one thing that they wanted to do, which was to stop. To put down the tools and the weapon and the responsibility and simply stop. But stopping was not an option because there were still people alive behind me, people who needed the barricade to hold and the last guns to fire and the corporal to keep functioning, and the debt I owed to the dead was paid in the currency of keeping the living alive for one more hour. That is the economy of the Imperial Guard. You do not fight for victory. You fight for time, and you buy it with everything you have, and the exchange rate is always worse than you expected. Brennick found me on the morning of day 38, sitting behind the barricade with the dismantled heavy stubber in my lap, cleaning carbon residue from the firing mechanism with a precision that was probably excessive, but that my hands needed to maintain. He lowered himself onto the ground beside me with the careful movements of a man whose body was giving him trouble, and I noticed that he was breathing harder than usual and that his skin had a grayish undertone that I wanted to attribute to fatigue, but could not, in honesty, attribute to anything other than what it was. He did not mention it. I did not mention it. We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, packed with everything that two people know about each other and about the situation they are in, and about the outcome that is approaching with the slow, shuffling inevitability of the dead. Then he asked me if I remembered the ash wastes. I told him I remembered. He asked me if I remembered what we used to say back in Kosengard about the ash. The old lower tier saying that the juvies used to repeat to each other before they crossed the wastes on a dare. I told him I remembered that too. The saying was, the ash takes slow and the ash takes fast, but the ash takes. It was not comforting. Hive wisdom rarely is. It was simply an acknowledgement that some things are inevitable, and that the only choice you have is how you face them. I did not ask Brennick why he was thinking about the ash wastes.
He was
I did
thinking
not
of home.
need to. He told me to
He was thinking of home. Skyrim, guys. Remember Skyrim? Nord's last thought should be of home.
keep the squad tight. He told me that Danik was a good soldier, and that Petchov was the steadiest man he had ever served with, and that if I managed to get them off this world, he would consider our account settled. I told him we would all get off this world together, which was a lie, and we both knew it was a lie, but I said it anyway because some lies are not deception but kindness, the verbal equivalent of Danik's hand finding mine in front of the furnace. He smiled at that, a small, tired expression that did not reach his eyes, but was genuine in a way that mattered more than warmth. Then he stood up, slowly, and put his hand on my shoulder, and the weight of it was the weight of everything he was not saying and everything I was not ready to hear. Sergeant Brennick Hall died on the barricade 6 hours later, during a walker surge that hit the line from 3 directions simultaneously. He did not turn. Whatever grace existed in the universe of Morthaven Quintus, it granted him that. A walker got through the line at a weak point and caught him from the side, and the impact took him down, and by the time Petchov fought through to him, the damage was mortal, and there was no corruption in it, just the plain, brutal physics of a human body meeting a force it could not withstand. I reached him in time to see his eyes still open and still clear and still recognizably his. And the last thing he said to me was nothing that belongs in a regimental history, nothing profound or wise. He said, "Fix the line, Trask." And I did. I fixed the line. I fixed the line because that was the last order my sergeant gave me, and because fixing things was the only language I had left. The Auspex readings came through on the evening of day 38, barely 3 hours after we burned Brennick. The garrison's surviving tech adept, working from a cogitator array that was failing in stages, detected multiple vessel signatures entering high orbit.
Hey,
Warships.
reinforcements.
Imperial warships, a full flotilla by the signature density, translating from the immaterium into real space above Morthaven Quintus. The information moved through the perimeter faster than any official communication could have carried it, spreading from Vox operator to runner to trooper in a chain of whispered repetition that had the quality of prayer. Ships. Imperial ships. Someone had heard. Someone had
Wait, in the grim darkness of the far future, it could only be exterminados. This can't be good news.
come. For 8 hours, something moved through the remnants of the 206th that I had not felt since the first walker had risen on day 7. Something fragile and dangerous and irrational and absolutely essential.
Hope.
Hope. Danek's eyes changed. Pechov straightened a fraction of a centimeter, which for Pechov was the equivalent of a parade ground salute. Troopers who had been functioning on reflex and discipline for days found something deeper, something that put light back into faces that had gone gray with exhaustion and loss. I heard laughter on the line that night. Laughter. The sound was so foreign that it took me a moment to identify it, and when I did, it hurt in a way I was not prepared for, because laughter is a sound that belongs to people who believe they have a future. And for 8 hours, we believed we had one. I told myself not to believe it. I told myself that hope is a weapon the universe uses against you, that the ash wastes taught you never to trust the ground beneath your feet. But I believed it anyway, because I am human, and humans are built to hope, even when hoping is the cruelest thing they can do to themselves. I stood on the wall and looked up at a sky I could not see through the perpetual haze of corruption, and I imagined the ships up there, Imperial Navy vessels, with holds full of soldiers and supplies and evacuation shuttles, and for 8 hours Morthaven Quintus was not a grave. It was a place you could leave. The full Vox transmission came on day 39. It was intercepted by the regimental astropath, or rather by the surviving member of the astropathic choir who was still functional. A trembling, bleeding-eyed woman named Savelli, who operated from a reinforced chamber in the garrison's command bunker, and who had been screaming intermittently for the past week as the psychic pressure of millions of plague dead pressed against whatever barriers her mind maintained between herself and the immaterium. The transmission was fragmented, corrupted by the same warp taint that suffused the planet's atmosphere, but Savelli pulled enough from it to construct a message that she delivered to Colonel Hassan, the regimental commander, in a voice that had gone flat with exhaustion and the particular emptiness of a person who has heard something they cannot unhear. The message was from Battlefleet Morthaven, specifically from the flagship of a quarantine flotilla that had taken station in high orbit. Not a relief force, a quarantine flotilla. The distinction is the distance between salvation and a death sentence, measured in 2 words. It confirmed that the plague had spread beyond Coravile. Every major population center on Morthaven Quintus was compromised. The outlying settlements were overrun. The planetary PDF had collapsed as an organized force, and the Inquisition, specifically the Ordo Sepulturum, had assessed the situation and rendered a judgment that was delivered in the cold, clinical language of bureaucratic apocalypse. Morthaven Quintus was classified as Perdita, lost. The quarantine fleet was not there to extract survivors. It was there to ensure that nothing left the planet. The cordon would be maintained indefinitely. No vessel would be permitted to break orbit. No shuttle would be cleared for launch. The world was sealed, and everyone on it, living and dead and somewhere in between, was sealed with it. The ships I had looked up at, The ships that had put light back into Danek's eyes and straightened Petrov's spine and drawn laughter from men and women who had forgotten the shape of it were not there to save us. They were there to make sure we stayed. There would be no reinforcements, no extraction, no relief column breaking through in a blaze of heroic glory. The Imperium had weighed Morthaven Quintus against the risk of the plague spreading to other systems and decided, with the merciless arithmetic that governs 10,000 years of human survival among the stars, that one world was an acceptable price. I understood the logic. A single world against the species. There was no argument to be made that could tip that balance, and any commander who tried to make one would be guilty of a sentimentality that the Imperium could not afford. But understanding the logic and accepting it are different things, and I did not accept it. Not because I believed we deserved rescue, which is a word that has no place in the vocabulary of the Astra Militarum, but because the people behind me, the ones still holding their last guns and still manning the barricade, and still breathing air that might be killing them with every inhalation, deserved to know that the universe they were fighting for had at least noticed that they were fighting. They deserved something, even if that something was only the acknowledgement that they existed, and that their existence, however brief, had mattered. Colonel Hassan did not tell the regiment. That was his decision, and I will not second-guess it, because I was not in his position, and the weight of command at that level is something I cannot comprehend. What filtered down through the chain was a directive to consolidate, conserve ammunition, and prepare for extended operations. The phrase extended operations did enough work on its own. Every veteran in the regiment heard it and understood what it meant, which was that no one was coming, and the only question left was how long we could keep the walls up before the dead pulled them down. But Commissar Serene told the senior NCOs the truth, because Serene understood that you cannot ask men and women to die well on the basis of a lie, and he respected us enough to let us choose how we carried the knowledge. I told my squad. Brennick would have told them, and I was their sergeant now. The field promotion coming from Captain Henk, with the weary formality of a man handing out ranks that nobody wanted, because the people who had held them before were dead. Sergeant Trask. It did not feel real. Nothing felt real on Morthaven Quintus anymore, which was perhaps the plague's final cruelty, the way it dissolved not just flesh, but the sense of reality itself, so that you moved through the days in a state that was not quite wakefulness and not quite dream, but something in between, a gray twilight of function where you did what needed to be done, because your body remembered how, even when your mind had retreated to a place beyond the reach of what was happening. I told them there would be no extraction. I told them the planet was sealed. I told them that our job had not changed, which was to hold the line and fight and survive for as long as survival was possible, and that when survival was no longer possible, our job would change to making the enemy pay for every centimeter of ground in a currency so high that even the dead would feel the cost. I told them this in the flat, practical voice that Brennick would have used, and I watched their faces as the words landed. And what I saw was not despair, not exactly. It was a settling, similar to what I had felt after Maven's death, but collective. The shared recognition of a truth that had been approaching since the first walker got back up, and that had now finally arrived. They were soldiers of the Imperium. They had always known, in the part of themselves, that the Primer tried to paint over with faith and duty and the promise of glory, that the Imperium would spend them. That was what soldiers were for. The only surprise was the timing. Danik looked at me after I finished speaking, and in her eyes I saw something that was not fear and was not resignation, but was closer to a question, though not one she would ever ask out loud. The question was whether I believed what I had just told them, whether I thought there was honor in a last stand that no one would remember on a world that the Imperium had written off, whether the act of fighting
Of course
when
not.
fighting could not save you was
What's not the
meaningful
point?
or just reflexive, the twitch of a nerve in a body that was already dead. I did not know the answer. I still do not know the answer. But I held her gaze and gave her the only thing I could, which was the steadiness that Brenek had given me, and that the guard gives to every soldier who stays on the line 1 minute longer than their courage should allow. Not certainty, not hope, just presence. The simple, stubborn, irrational insistence on being here, now, with your weapon in your hands and your squad at your side, and that is either everything or it is nothing, and I have never been able to decide which. The final perimeter was a square, roughly 400 meters on a side, centered on the PDF garrison complex and containing the last functional structures in Coravile that had not been overrun, burned, or dissolved by the creeping rot that was consuming the city's physical fabric as thoroughly as the plague consumed its people. Within that square were approximately 340 soldiers from 5 companies that had once numbered over 2,000. There were perhaps 100 civilians gathered from the last evacuations and housed in the garrison's underground storage levels. There were ammunition stocks for perhaps 48 hours of sustained combat at current rates of expenditure. There was water for 5 days. There was food for 7. The mathematics had not changed since Brennec's calculation on the data slate all those weeks ago. They had simply reached their conclusion. I held the eastern wall of the perimeter with what remained of 2nd Platoon, which was now 11 people including myself. Danik was my senior trooper, a rank she had earned not through promotion boards or officer recommendations, but through the simple process of outliving everyone who had been senior to her.
It's a process of elimination.
Petrov was still there, still solid, still saying almost nothing, which at this point felt less like reticence and more like a philosophical position. The others were a mix of replacements and survivors from other squads, people whose names I had learned in the past week, and who I led with the authority of someone who had been there longer than them, and nothing more. We were not a squad in any meaningful tactical sense. We were a collection of tired, frightened, determined individuals who happened to be standing on the same wall, and if that sounds insufficient for the task of holding a perimeter against an endless tide of plague dead, then you understand our situation perfectly. The walkers hit the perimeter constantly, not in waves, not with the ebb and flow of a military assault, but with the ceaseless, uniform pressure of a natural force, like water rising against a dam. They moaned and pressed and clawed and pushed, and we fired into them and burned them and pushed them back, and they came again and again and again, with a patience that was not really patience, because patience implies a capacity for waiting, and the dead did not wait. They simply persisted. They were the plague made ambulatory, the physical expression of a corruption that had no agenda beyond its own spread. And fighting them was like fighting the weather, an act of defiance against something that did not know or care that you were defying it. I noticed the cold on the evening of day 41. It started in my hands, a numbness in the fingers that I attributed to fatigue, and the constant vibration of the last gun, and the chill of nights spent on an open wall without adequate insulation. I flexed my hands and rubbed them together and told myself it was nothing, because telling yourself it was nothing was the first and most natural line of defense against the knowledge that it might be something. The cold crept up my forearms over the next 2 hours, a slow, insidious advance that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature and everything to do with the thing I had been carrying inside me since the first week, since the contaminated water, since the injections, since the moment I set foot on Morthaven Quintus and breathed in air that tasted of sweet rot and tired soil. I knew what it was. I think I had known for days, in the part of my mind that ran on instinct rather than analysis, the same part that had told me on arrival that the planet smelled tired. The cold was the first symptom. Not the cough, not the veins, not the discoloration. The cold. The particular internal cold that Colm had described before he stopped talking. The sensation of something moving beneath the skin that was not quite pain, but close enough to pain's territory that the distinction ceased to matter. I had heard Verth describe the progression enough times to map it against what I was feeling and to know, with a certainty that left no room for denial, that the plague had reached its patient conclusion in me. I did not tell anyone. This was not bravery, and it was not foolishness.
What would have been the
It
point?
was the same calculation that every infected soldier on Morthaven Quintus had made, which was that there was nothing to be done about it, and that telling people would only add their grief to the burden without subtracting anything from the disease. I had seen what the knowledge of infection did to the people around the infected, the way it drew the light out of their eyes and replaced it with a preemptive mourning that was almost worse than the actual loss. I did not want Danik to look at me with that light gone. I did not want Petchov's steady presence to falter because he was watching me for signs instead of watching the wall. I wanted the time I had left, however long that was, to be spent doing the only thing I knew how to do, which was hold the line and fix what was broken and keep the people behind me alive for one more hour. The cold reached my chest by midnight. My hands were shaking, a fine tremor that I masked by gripping my lasgun tighter and bracing it against the wall's parapet. The walkers came in a surge around midnight, a thick column that pushed against the eastern wall with enough mass to make the barrier creak and groan under the pressure. And for 20 minutes we poured lass fire into the column, and it did not diminish, and it did not slow. And the bodies piled up, and the bodies behind them climbed the pile, and the moaning was so loud and so close that it became part of the air itself, inseparable from the act of breathing. I fired until my power pack was drained and swapped it for a fresh one, and fired again. And the familiar rhythm of aim, fire, reset, aim, fire, reset, carried me through the surge, the way rhythm carries a worker through a shift in the factorum, the body performing actions that the mind has delegated to muscle memory, because the mind is occupied with staying intact. The surge broke, not because we defeated it, but because the walkers, lacking direction, eventually dispersed under the weight of their own dead piled against the wall. We had perhaps an hour before the next one. I used the time to check my squad. Danik was functional, her face drawn and her eyes hollow, but her hands steady on her weapon. Petchov was Petchov. The others were alive, which was the only metric that mattered. I walked the line, checking positions and ammunition counts and barricade integrity, and at each position I stopped and looked the trooper in the eye and said something, not motivational speeches or rousing rhetoric, but small, specific things. You are doing well. Your firing position is good. Drink some water. Take a ration bar. The small human acts of maintenance that a sergeant performs, not because they change the tactical situation, but because they remind the people on the line that someone is paying attention to them, that they are not alone, that the person responsible for them is still functioning and still present, and still, against all evidence and reason, standing. The cold was in my spine now. I could feel it moving, not with the speed of a fever, but with the slow, deliberate advance of something that knew it had all the time in the world, because the outcome was assured and only the schedule was in question. I thought about Colm. I thought about Vasek. I thought about all the others who had felt this same cold creep through them and who had ended the same way, gray and groaning and empty of everything that had made them who they were. I wondered if Colm
Oh, hey, Zara, what's up?
had been conscious at the end, trapped inside the walking thing that his body had become, aware but unable to speak or act or do anything except watch through eyes that were no longer his own. Verth had said the victims remained conscious. She had said it clinically, as a medical observation, but the horror of it had been there in her voice, the knowledge that the plague did not simply kill you, but imprisoned you inside your own corpse and made you a witness to the atrocities your body committed without your consent. I did not want that. Nobody wanted that. But wanting and getting are different currencies on Morthaven Quintus, and the exchange rate, as always, was not in our favor. I went back to my position on the wall. The moaning was building again, which meant another surge was forming in the darkness beyond our floodlights. I checked my last gun. 4 power packs remaining. The mathematics said that was good for 40 to 60 kills, assuming accuracy was maintained and the walkers obliged by presenting their skulls at optimal angles. The mathematics said a lot of things on Morthaven Quintus, and most of them ended the same way, which was with the number approaching 0. I racked a fresh pack into the receiver and settled the stock against my shoulder and waited, and while I waited, I thought about the ash wastes of Gelt Novus, about the gray drifts that could swallow a crawler, about the saying that the Juvies used to repeat to each other before they crossed. The ash takes slow and the ash takes fast, but the ash takes. The surge came. They always came. They would always come, because the dead of Morthaven Quintus outnumbered the living by a margin so vast that the word outnumbered lost its meaning, the way a number loses its meaning when it gets large enough. You stop counting. You stop calculating. You stop thinking about tomorrow or the next hour or the next magazine change. You exist in the present tense, which is the only tense that matters on a firing line, the eternal now of aim, fire, reset, aim, fire, reset. The walkers came through the darkness and into the light, and I shot them, and they fell, and more came behind them, and I shot those too, and the cold in my body was a counterpoint to the heat of the last gun in my hands, and somewhere beneath the cold I could feel the first faint stirring of something that was not me, something that was patient and hungry and intimately familiar with the inside of my chest in a way that nothing should be familiar with the inside of a living person. Danik was beside me. Petchoff was 3 meters to my left. They were firing. Everyone was firing. The wall was holding. The wall was always holding until it was not, and the difference between holding and not holding was measured in seconds, and ammunition and the willingness of the people on the line to keep pulling the trigger, even when pulling the trigger had become an act of faith rather than an act of tactics.
Because what
I
else is
pulled
there?
the trigger. The last bolt hit a walker in the face, and the face came apart and the body dropped, and another took its place, and I pulled the trigger again, because that is what you do. That is what a corporal does. That is what a sergeant does. That is what a soldier of the Astra Militarum does on the wall of a dying city on a sealed world at the edge of a quarantine zone that the Imperium has written off as acceptable losses. You hold the line, you fire your weapon, you fix what is broken. You stand beside the people who are standing beside you, and you do not stop until your body stops for you, and if your body is in the process of being stolen by something ancient and corrupt and hungry, then you use what time it has left in it to do the only thing that time was ever good for, which is to buy 1 more minute for the person next to you. The cold reached my throat. I could feel it there, a tightness that was not a cough, not yet, but that carried in it the promise of a cough, the first whisper of the sound that would eventually become the moan, the sound that connected every dead thing on this world to every other dead thing in a choir that sang to a god whose name I was forbidden
turning.
to speak. I swallowed against the tightness and raised my weapon and fired again and again and again, and the night was full of light and noise and death, and the moaning of the millions, and the barking of lost guns, and the sound of my own breathing, which was still mine, still recognizably
It's
mine,
turning.
for now, for this moment, for however many moments remained before the cold finished what it had started. Danik looked at me between volleys. She knew. I saw it in her face, in the way her eyes found me and held and did not look away. She knew, and she did not say anything, because we had learned by then that some things are better left in the silence where they can be carried without the weight of words. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and the look said
Look at me.
everything that the ash wastes had
Then
taught
look at
us,
him.
and that the plague had confirmed, and that the Emperor, if he was watching, already knew. We are still here. The line is holding. Keep going. I kept going. The trigger pulled smooth. The last bolt flew true. The wall of the dead rose higher, and the living stood behind it and fired into the darkness beyond, and the darkness pressed back, and somewhere in the exchange between the light and the dark, the story of Corporal Fennig Trask, Sergeant Fennig
Sergeant.
Trask, of the 206th Geltian Line Infantry, hive-born, ash-runner, fixer of broken things, reached its final page. Not with glory, not with a speech or a last charge or any of the things the pamphlets promise. Just a man on a wall with a lasgun and a cold that was not cold, and a line that needed holding for one more minute. One more minute. The ash takes slow and the ash takes fast, but the ash takes.
That it does. My God, the way these things end. Anyways, you guys, I think I need to call it a night. Also a night. I've been at it like for the past 12 hours. I will see you all on Sunday morning, alright? Uh Again, like it if you do. And subscribe. Emperor knows we need it, alright? Bye!